They don't kill you in my town. They just snip the thread that holds you to the world. Hello, and welcome to Night Drive Stories. My name's Jack, and I drive the silent highways of the Pacific Northwest long after midnight, picking up those who wander these misty roads. Tonight, let me tell you the story I heard from the stranger I picked up just outside the old truck stop at mile marker 99. But before, if you like these eerie stories about the lost wanderers I meet along the way, remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel. She was standing under the flickering neon sign of a closed-down diner, the kind of place that probably hadn't served a hot meal since the interstate was built. She held no thumb out, just a small, worn backpack clutched to her chest like a shield. When my headlights washed over her, she didn't flinch, just watched me approach with an unnerving stillness. She looked young, maybe 20, but her eyes held the kind of exhaustion you see in people 4 times her age. She climbed into the cab without a word, the door closing with a soft, final click. For a long time, the only sounds were the hum of the engine and the rhythmic thump of the wipers clearing away a light drizzle. "Where you headed?" I finally asked, my voice gentle. She jumped, as if startled from a deep trance. "Away," she said, her voice a dry whisper. "Just away from here." I nodded, not pressing. Some people on these roads just need the miles to do the talking for them. We drove on, the dark pines of Oregon slipping past us like ghosts. After about an hour, she finally spoke again, unprompted. "Have you ever seen a place that was too perfect?" she asked, her gaze fixed on the hypnotic white lines of the highway. "So perfect it made your teeth ache?" I told her I couldn't say I had. "I have," she said, and a single tear traced a path down her dusty cheek. "I was born there, and I pray to a God I don't believe in that I die somewhere else. Anywhere else." And as the night deepened, she told me the story of Harmony Creek. "It had a name like something out of a storybook," she began, her fingers nervously pleating the fabric of her jeans. "Harmony Creek. Even the sound of it is a lie. It suggests peace, a gentle babbling brook. But the quiet in Harmony Creek wasn't peaceful. It was the held-breath quiet of a hospital room, of a place where one wrong sound could make everything flatline. From the outside, it was perfect. A postcard from a past that never existed. Tidy little houses with white picket fences, manicured lawns, vibrant flower boxes on every windowsill. There was no crime. No one was ever homeless or hungry. The sheriff, a big, placid man named Miller, mostly dealt with lost dogs and parade permits. We had one of everything we needed. One grocery store, one gas station, one school, one church that everyone attended on Sunday, not out of any fiery conviction, but because it was part of the routine. The town was founded 150 years ago by a man named Elias Thorne. They called him the Founder. His portrait hung in the town hall, a severe-looking man with piercing eyes who preached a philosophy of benevolent order. He taught that true harmony came from every person understanding their place in the great pattern of the community and fulfilling their role without question or complaint. His philosophy was the bedrock of everything. We learned it in school. It was in the gentle platitudes of Pastor Michael's sermons. It was in the way neighbors would smile at you, a wide, empty smile that didn't quite reach their eyes, if you were playing your music a little too loud or let your lawn go a day too long. "The pattern is strongest when every thread is taut," they'd say. It sounded like wisdom, but it felt like a threat. The rituals went beyond just smiles and sayings. Twice a year, there was the civic mending. A one house, deemed the most out of tune, a peeling porch railing, a less than vibrant lawn, would be selected. On a Saturday morning, the entire town would descend upon it in silence, armed with paintbrushes, hammers, and gardening tools. They would work for hours without speaking, their movements synchronized, until the house was remade into a perfect copy of its neighbors. It wasn't a barn raising, it was an exorcism of individuality. The family whose home was chosen was expected to provide lemonade and look grateful, but their eyes always held a deep, burning shame. They were a fray that had required the whole cloth to be rewoven. I always felt it, that wrongness, like a single, low-frequency hum that no one else seemed to notice. It was in the way no one ever really argued, in the way teenagers never rebelled, beyond maybe staying out a half-hour past curfew. It was in the way the leaves on the oak trees in the town square were always the most brilliant shade of crimson in the fall, every single year, without fail. It was an aggressive, suffocating perfection. My brother Caleb, he didn't feel it. He was 7 years my junior, and he was pure sunshine. He loved Harmony Creek. He believed in the stories of the founder, in the goodness of the pattern. He was all heart, all trusting innocence. He was the one thing in my life that felt completely, uncomplicatedly real. And that, I think, is why they chose him. The announcement came, as it always did, on the first day of spring. The whole town gathered in the square for the vernal equinox picnic. Mayor Thompson got up on the gazebo, his face beaming. He talked about the importance of tradition, of honoring the founder, and of the upcoming Founders Festival, the biggest event of our year. It was the culmination of everything, a celebration of our perfect, unchanging town. And then he made the announcement. "And now," he'd said, his voice booming with false sincerity, "it is my great honor to announce the Keystone for this year's Founders Festival." There was a collective, joyful intake of breath from the crowd. Being the Keystone was the greatest honor a person could receive. It meant you were the embodiment of the town's spirit, the perfect thread. "This year's Keystone," the mayor declared, "is young Caleb Miller. My name is Alara Miller. He was my brother." The crowd erupted in applause, a wave of sound that felt like a physical blow. People were turning to my parents, congratulating them, their faces shining with pride. My mother was crying, happy tears streaming down her face. My father was shaking the mayor's hand, looking overwhelmed with joy. After the ceremony, people crowded around us, but they weren't looking at my parents or me. They were looking at Caleb. They would reach out and touch his shoulder or his hair, a strange, reverent look in their eyes, as if he were no longer a little boy, but a holy relic, an object. My father's smile was stretched too tight, his hand gripping my mother's with bone-white knuckles, and my mother's happiness was feverish, almost manic. She looked at Caleb with an ecstatic glow, as if his selection had validated her entire existence. But I looked at Caleb. He was standing there, a 10-year-old boy, bewildered, and then thrilled as the weight of the town's adoration settled on his small shoulders. Everyone was smiling. But I felt a cold, sharp dread pierce through me, so intense it made me feel sick. I looked around at all those happy, smiling faces, and all I could see were predators. It was the smile of the wolf looking at the lamb. They weren't celebrating my brother. They were congratulating themselves on a successful hunt. That night, I tried to talk to him. I found him in his room, practicing the serene, still posture he'd been told a Keystone must have. I asked him if he was scared. He just looked at me with wide, innocent eyes, already parroting the lessons he'd been taught his whole life. "Scared? Why would I be scared, Alara? It's the biggest honor. I get to make the pattern stronger for everyone." He said it with such earnestness, such pride. It was the moment I realized he was already lost to them, and I was utterly, terrifyingly alone. Everyone kept saying he was chosen, but I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that he hadn't been chosen. He had been sentenced. After the announcement, the world tilted on its axis, Alara continued, her voice barely a whisper above the engine's drone. The town's gentle, passive-aggressive pressure became a focused, loving suffocation. Neighbors brought over pies and casseroles. My parents walked around in a daze of pride. They started planning Caleb's Keystone trousseau, a traditional all-white outfit he was to wear for the festival. To them, this was like their son had won a scholarship to an Ivy League school. To me, it felt like they were fitting him for a shroud. I couldn't explain my fear. It was a phantom I couldn't point to. If I said, "I think something bad is going to happen to Caleb," they'd look at me with such pity. "Oh, Alara," my mother would say, her voice soft and condescending. "It's a great honor. You're just being selfish, wanting to keep him all to yourself. We all have to share him with the pattern now." Share him. That word chilled me. It wasn't about celebrating him. It was about consuming him. I started having nightmares, not of monsters or violence, but of emptiness. I'd dream I was calling Caleb's name in our house, but all the rooms were bare, and my voice made no sound. I'd wake up with my heart pounding, and I'd have to creep into his room just to watch the gentle rise and fall of his chest, reassuring myself he was still there. In my desperation, I tried to find an ally, someone else my age who might have seen the cracks in the facade. I cornered a boy named Finn after school, someone I'd always thought had a spark of rebellion in him. I tried to explain my fears, my voice low and urgent. He listened patiently, his head tilted. When I was finished, he just smiled that placid Harmony Creek smile. "You're just nervous, Ilara," he said, his voice as smooth as Riverstone's. "It's a big responsibility for your family. Maybe you should talk to the pastor. He helps people find their proper place in the pattern." He patted my shoulder and walked away, leaving me standing there with the cold realization that the rot went all the way down. The children were just as much a part of the prison as the adults. My desperation led me to dig, to search for the source of this cold dread. It led me back to a memory I had buried, something from when I was very young, maybe 5 or 6. It was about my mother. My mother, Sarah, was the picture of a Harmony Creek wife, cheerful, serene, always baking, always volunteering. But in this fragmented memory, she was different. It was late at night. I'd woken up thirsty and crept downstairs. I found her in the living room, sitting in the dark, staring at the empty wall where the family photos hung. She was weeping, not loudly, but with a deep, silent, world-shattering grief that terrified me. It was the sound of a soul that had been hollowed out. I remember the smell of rain on hot asphalt from the storm outside, and the way the thunder rattled the window panes, punctuating her silent sobs. She didn't know I was there. I saw her cradle her right hand, and in the sliver of moonlight coming through the window, I saw something on the back of it. A mark. It was a delicate, intricate spiral, like a tiny galaxy or a fingerprint, and it seemed to be glowing with a faint, silvery light. It looked like a scar, but it was too perfect, too deliberate. She was stroking it with the thumb of her other hand, a gesture of both pain and reverence, as if touching a wound that would never heal. The next morning, she was her usual self again, humming in the kitchen as she made pancakes, a bright, fixed smile on her face. When I glanced at her hand, there was nothing there. I convinced myself I had dreamed it. But now, the memory came back with a vengeance. Had my mother been a Keystone? No, that didn't make sense. She was right here. But what if she had lost someone? A brother, a sister? I had never heard of her having any siblings. My grandparents, her parents, were long dead. There was no one to ask. This new, terrifying thought became an obsession. I started watching the other adults in town, the ones from my parents' generation. I looked for that same flicker of buried sorrow behind their placid smiles, and I started to find it. I began to notice that this secret grief club had tells. Mr. Jensen, the grocer, would always touch his right palm when he thought no one was looking, a phantom itch. Mrs. Gable would trace a spiral in the dust on her library desk. I realized Mr. Jensen's moments of quiet despair always came in mid-August, and I cross-referenced it with Old Town newspapers in the library. 30 years ago, in mid-August, the festival had been held. It was all connected. These people weren't just sad, they were living memorials, their sorrow a clock that reset every single year. There was Mr. Jensen, the grocer. He was always jovial, always ready with a bad joke. But one afternoon, I saw him standing in the canned goods aisle, staring at a single can of peaches with an expression of such profound loss on his face that it stopped me in my tracks. A moment later he saw me, and the happy mask snapped back into place. Then there was Mrs. Gable, the librarian. I saw her once tracing a name in an old high school yearbook with a trembling finger. The name was David Gable. Her son? I'd never known she had a son. When she realized I was watching, she slammed the book shut with a look of pure panic. These people, I realized, were all carrying a ghost. A secret, personal grief that was never, ever spoken of, but which lived deep in their eyes. I started calling them the anchors. They were anchored to a sorrow that no one else could see. My mother was one of them. She was an anchor for someone I never knew existed. My search for proof became frantic. One night when my parents were at a town meeting, a planning session for the festival, of course, I went into their bedroom. I didn't know what I was looking for. I just knew I had to find something. I went through old chests, photo albums, keepsake boxes. In the very bottom of my mother's cedar chest, beneath her wedding dress and old linens, I found a small, locked metal box. My heart hammered against my ribs. I had to pry it open with a screwdriver from the garage, the sound echoing the frantic splintering of my own composure. Inside, there was only one thing, a single faded photograph. It was of my mother, as a teenager, standing with her arm around another girl. A girl who looked almost exactly like her, an identical twin. They were both smiling, happy. On the back in my mother's youthful handwriting it said, "Sarah and Lily, summer of '98, best friends forever. Lily." I had an aunt named Lily. An identical twin sister my parents had never mentioned, not once. Where was she? What happened to her? Then I saw it. On the back of my mother's hand in the photograph, plain as day, was the beginning of that silvery spiral mark. And I knew, with a certainty that was as cold and hard as granite, what had happened to her. Lily had been the keystone, and my mother, her twin, was the anchor left behind to carry the memory of her existence, a memory the rest of the world had been forced to forget. Jack's voice, a low rumble in the dark, broke the spell of her story. Her twin sister? Just erased? Ilara nodded, her eyes wide and haunted in the dashboard's faint glow. Erased, she repeated, the word tasting like poison. That's the only word for it. It wasn't just that they didn't talk about her. It was like she had never been. No photos on the wall, no mention of her name, no grave in the cemetery. Just a hole in the world that only my mother, in her darkest, most private moments, was allowed to see. Finding that photo was like finding a key, but the key didn't open a door. It just showed me that the house I lived in was built on a foundation of lies. My focus shifted. This wasn't just about my family's secret grief anymore. This was about the town's entire operating system, the how and the why. The answers I knew had to be with the founder himself, Elias Thorne. His smiling, benevolent portrait was everywhere, but his true teachings, his real doctrine, that was kept under lock and key. Literally. The town archives were housed in the basement of the town hall, a place that was technically public, but functionally forbidden. Mrs. Gable, the librarian I'd seen with the yearbook, was also the town archivist. She guarded it like a dragon. Access was by appointment only, for approved historical research. I started watching her, studying her routine. Every morning at 9, she would unlock the heavy oak door to the archives, and every evening at 5, she would lock it. But before she turned the key, she would place her palm flat against the wood for a full 10 seconds, as if communing with it, or warding it. Her vigilance was that of a priestess, not a clerk. A teenage girl trying to figure out why she felt like her brother was about to be ritually sacrificed was not going to be approved. So, I did something I'd never done in my life. I broke the rules. All of them. I stole the master key to the town hall from the janitor's closet during the school day. That night, after my parents were asleep, I slipped out of my house, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. Harmony Creek at night was a different animal. The daytime perfection curdled into something deeply sinister. The identical houses were like rows of tombs, the streetlights casting a sterile, buzzing glow, the silence so absolute it felt like the whole town was holding its breath, listening for me. As I cut through the park, my breath fogging in the chill air, I saw a lone figure standing by the founder's statue. It was Sheriff Miller, not on patrol, just standing there, motionless, looking up at the stone face of Elias Thorne as if awaiting orders. I flattened myself behind a hedge, my heart trying to beat its way out of my chest, and waited for him to move on. His stillness was terrifying, a sentinel guarding a sleeping evil. Letting myself into the silent, cavernous town hall was the most terrifying thing I had ever done. My footsteps echoed on the marble floor. The founder's portrait watched me from the top of the stairs, his painted eyes seeming to follow me. I made my way to the basement, the air growing colder, smelling of dust and decay and secrets. The archive room was behind a heavy oak door. The key turned with a loud, grating click. Inside it was a maze of tall metal shelves groaning with ledgers, boxes, and books. This was the town's memory, and I knew most of it was a fabrication. I was looking for the source code. I didn't know where to start. I ran my flashlight over faded labels. Town Council minutes 1920-1940. Property deeds. Festival committee records. It was all mundane, all part of the carefully constructed lie. I needed to find Thorne's personal effects. In a back corner, behind a stack of old newspapers, I found a heavy iron safe. It was ancient. There was a spiral pattern, the same as the anchor's mark, engraved on the dial. I felt a surge of adrenaline. This was it. Of course, it was locked. I was about to give up, my heart sinking, when I remembered something from a history lesson. Thorne's personal motto. It was written on the base of his statue in the square. Order is the thread. The community is the cloth. The pattern is the divine. I tried the numbers corresponding to the letters. THREAD, CLOTH, PATTERN. Nothing. My hands were shaking. I was running out of time. Then I thought about the anchors, the grief, the sacrifice, the real price. On a desperate whim, I tried a different word. A name. LILY. I turned the dial. With a heavy grinding groan, the tumblers fell into place. The safe was open. The air that wafted out of the safe was cold and smelled of ozone and something else, something like dried herbs and static electricity. Inside, protected by oiled leather, were not the sanitized, published journals we read in school, but a stack of slim, handwritten notebooks. Alongside them lay a strange object, a piece of polished black rock, like obsidian, but it wasn't cold. When I hesitantly reached out and touched it, it was warm, and a faint, low vibration hummed up my arm. It felt ancient and alive. I snatched my hand back as if burned and focused on the journals. I sat on the cold, dusty floor, my flashlight beam trembling, and I began to read. What I read destroyed the last vestiges of the world I knew. Thorne wasn't just a philosopher. He was a mystic, a madman. He wrote that on his initial survey of the land, he had made contact with an entity. He didn't describe it as a god or a demon. He called it the Weaver, or sometimes the Silent Partner. It was a being of immense, non-human intelligence that existed outside of our perception of time and space. He claimed it was the architect of reality itself, weaving the fabric of the world from the threads of possibility. He wrote that he'd made a pact. The Weaver would grant his town a perfect, stable existence, a flawless pattern, free from chaos, decay, and misfortune. In exchange, the town had to provide the raw materials for its maintenance. The Weaver, he wrote, fed on potent, focused human emotion. But the most powerful thread, the one it used to mend the frays and holes in the pattern, was grief. Pure, unfiltered grief, born from the sudden, violent severing of a deep bond. The Founders' Festival was the mechanism for this. The Keystone wasn't killed. That was too crude. They were unwoven, plucked from the pattern of reality like a loose thread. Their existence, their memory, every trace of them, was erased from the world. But to complete the process, one person who loved them most had to be left behind to remember. The anchor. The anchor's solitary secret grief was the payment. It was the thread the Weaver used to restitch the fabric of their perfect town, smoothing over the hole left by the Keystone. I read about the anchor's mark, the spiral. It was a psychic brand, a focal point for the grief, which faded as the sorrow was consumed over the years. My mother's grief for her twin sister had literally fueled the prosperity I'd grown up in. Our perfect lawns, our good health, our lack of crime. It was all paid for by her silent, secret tears. And now, Caleb was the Keystone. And I, the person who loved him most in the world, the only one willing to see the truth. I was to be his anchor. This wasn't just his death sentence. It was my damnation. Knowing the truth was like living in a different dimension from everyone else, Elara said, hugging herself as if a deep chill had settled in her bones. I was walking through the same streets as everyone else in Harmony Creek, but I was seeing the source code. The smiles of my neighbors were no longer just empty. They were predatory. The town's perfection wasn't just suffocating. It was parasitic. It was feeding on the love I had for my brother, and I was the only one who could see the bite marks. I had to get him out. The thought became a singular, burning obsession. But how? I couldn't go to my parents. They were the high priests of this whole nightmare. When I tried, gently at first, to voice my concerns, my mother would get that pitying look in her eye. "Oh, sweetie," she'd say, stroking my hair. "It's natural to feel a little possessive, but you have to let him go. It's his turn to strengthen the pattern. Let him go." The words were so casual, so monstrous. I realized then that she wasn't just a victim of the system. She was a willing participant. Her own grief had been sanctified, turned into a noble sacrifice, and she expected me to follow in her footsteps. The town began to groom me for my role. It was insidious. Pastor Michael delivered a sermon about the biblical story of Abraham and Isaac, but he twisted it. In his version, Abraham's grief was a beautiful gift to God, a thread of faith that strengthened the world. He looked directly at me from the pulpit as he said it. A few days later, Mrs. Gable approached me in the library and gifted me a beautiful leather-bound journal with a blank spiral-embossed cover. "It's good to have a place to record your feelings during times of great transition," she said, her voice full of false sympathy. They weren't just waiting for my grief, they were actively trying to cultivate it, to make it as pure and potent as possible. The Founders Festival was 2 weeks away. And then, the fading began. It was subtle at first, small inconsistencies, like glitches in a computer program. The first time it happened, Caleb and I were playing checkers on the living room floor. He'd just captured my last king and was doing his ridiculous victory dance. My dad walked in and said, "Sounds like someone's winning." He looked at the board, then at Caleb and chuckled. "Attaboy, Cameron." Caleb stopped dancing. "It's Caleb, Dad." My dad just blinked, a flicker of confusion in his eyes. Right. Caleb, of course. Long day." He ruffled Caleb's hair and walked into the kitchen. Caleb shrugged it off, but I felt a jolt of ice water in my veins. My father hadn't misspoken. The pattern was already starting to correct itself, starting to smudge the edges of my brother's existence. The glitches grew more frequent. A few days later, Caleb's best friend, a boy named Leo he'd been inseparable with since they were toddlers, came to our door. He asked my mom if I could play, not Caleb. When I pointed to Caleb sitting right there in the living room, Leo just squinted. "Who's that?" he asked, genuinely confused. Caleb looked up, his face crumpling with a hurt so profound it stole my breath. I tried to explain, my voice high and frantic. "Leo, it's Caleb, your best friend." Leo just shook his head slowly, a placid smile creeping onto his face. "I don't know any Caleb," he said, and walked away. My brother wept for an hour, and my parents told him he must have imagined the friendship. After that, the glitches became more terrifying. I went to get Caleb's favorite blue sweatshirt from the laundry. I couldn't find it. I searched the whole house. My mom, seeing me getting frantic, asked what was wrong. "I can't find Caleb's blue hoodie," I said. She just gave me a blank look. "Honey, Caleb doesn't have a blue hoodie. His favorite is the green one." I ran to his closet. The green hoodie was there. The blue one, the one he wore almost every day, was gone. Not just missing, but gone from my mother's memory. I was the only one who could see it. I was the anchor, and the fading was the process of isolating me in my future grief. I was being quarantined with his memory while the world slowly forgot him. The physical toll on Caleb was undeniable. His skin grew pale and took on a strange, clammy texture, even in our warm house. He lost his appetite entirely, not out of sickness, but because he seemed to have forgotten what food was for. I tried to tempt him with his favorite mac and cheese, and he just stared at it, picking up a noodle and watching it fall through his fingers, as if he couldn't remember how to close his hand. He was becoming a ghost in his own life. The most horrifying moment came when I was looking through a recent family photo album. There was a picture of the 4 of us at last year's town picnic. My mom, my dad, me. And next to me, where Caleb should have been, there was just a faint shimmering blur, like a heat haze in the shape of a small boy. His image was literally dissolving. I screamed. I threw the album at my parents, demanding they see it, demanding they acknowledge what was happening. "Look!" I shrieked, my finger trembling as I pointed at the blurry space. "He's disappearing. You have to see it." My father took my shoulders, his grip firm, his face a mask of serene disappointment. "Ilara, that's enough. This obsession of yours is unhealthy. It's a fray in the pattern. You need to be strong for Caleb's sake, for all our sakes." They saw my terror not as a valid response but as a flaw, a personal failing that needed to be corrected. My brother's sacrifice wasn't just about him. It was also about fixing me. That was the moment I knew I was completely on my own. I had 1 week until the festival. 1 week to plan an escape from a town that was a sentient, coordinated prison. 1 week before my brother was completely and irrevocably unwoven from the world. My plan was desperate and flimsy. I siphoned gas from my dad's car every night, a little at a time, filling up 2 large canisters I hid in the woods. I packed a bag with cash I'd saved, some food, a map. It felt pathetic, like a child's game. How do you plan an escape when the walls are in everyone's minds? Every person I passed on the street, every friendly wave from a neighbor, was a potential alarm. The town was the cult, and it was always watching. The night before the festival, I sat with Caleb in his room. He was quiet, subdued. The fading was affecting him now, making him feel tired, distant. "Are you scared, Caleb?" I whispered. He looked at me, and for a moment, the fog seemed to clear from his eyes. "A little," he confessed, his voice small. "It feels like I'm forgetting things. Like my name. Sometimes I have to say it to myself to remember." I pulled him into a hug, my heart shattering into a million pieces. "I'm going to fix this," I promised, my voice fierce. "Tomorrow night, we're going on an adventure. Just you and me. We're going to leave this place and never come back." He looked up at me, his eyes full of trust. A trust I had to honor, even if it meant running headlong into the heart of the nightmare. "The day of the Founders' Festival was the longest day of my life," Ilara said, her knuckles white as she gripped the dashboard. The sky was a perfect, cloudless, artificial-looking blue. The whole town was humming with a joyful, reverent energy that felt like a scream in my ears. My parents dressed Caleb in his white Keystone suit. He looked like a tiny, pale ghost, his eyes wide and unfocused. They kept telling him how proud they were, how important he was. They were grooming their lamb for the slaughter, and they called it love. My plan was to make our move during the festival's climax. The entire town would gather in the square just after sunset for the procession of light. The Keystone, Caleb, would be led to the founder's statue, where he would place a ceremonial wreath at its base. During that moment, all eyes would be on him. I hoped, prayed, that it would create enough of a diversion for me to get him and run to the woods where I'd stashed my car and the gas. The procession of light was even more terrifying than I remembered. The entire town, dressed in somber grays and whites, moved as one. They carried simple white candles, but the flames didn't flicker naturally in the breeze. They burned with a steady, unwavering intensity, casting long, distorted shadows. They hummed a low, guttural, tuneless chant that vibrated in my chest, a sound that felt older than the town itself. It was the sound of the loom, I realized, the sound of the pattern being reinforced. They moved in slow, overlapping spirals, a living representation of the founder's symbol, tightening the net around the town square and around my brother. As dusk fell, a procession of townspeople holding candles began to snake its way toward the square. The air was thick with the smell of candle wax and night-blooming jasmine. It was beautiful and utterly monstrous. I found Caleb standing with my parents near the gazebo, his face pale in the flickering light. I grabbed his hand. "It's time for our adventure," I whispered. He just nodded, his mind too fogged to question it. I started pulling him away from the crowd, toward the dark edge of the park that bordered the woods. And that's when I learned the true nature of the town's control. No one shouted. No one ran after us. But suddenly, our path was blocked. Mr. Jensen, the grocer, was standing there, holding his candle, a gentle smile on his face. "Evening, Ilara. Lovely night for the festival," he said, his body perfectly positioned so we couldn't get past without physically pushing him. As I tried to move around him, I noticed that everyone around us was moving with a placid, unnerving economy of motion. It was like watching a flock of birds turn in unison, a single will guiding hundreds of bodies. No one looked directly at us, but their movements were all in perfect, silent concert to contain us. It was a fluid, organic cage made of smiling people. I wheeled around, pulling Caleb in another direction. There was Mrs. Gable, the librarian, arranging a display of flowers on a picnic table we needed to get past. "Just tidying up," she said, her voice airy, her movements slow and deliberate, boxing us in. It was happening everywhere. The town was moving, a single organism, coordinating in perfect, smiling silence to head us off. They flowed like water, forming casual, impenetrable barriers. A group of teenagers would suddenly decide to start a game of tag in our path. A quartet of old men would stop to admire the moon, their bodies forming a solid wall. Sheriff Miller tipped his hat to me, stepping directly in front of me to chat with a deputy, his bulk a mountain I couldn't move. There was no aggression, no anger, just a calm, relentless, passive control. It was the most terrifying thing I've ever experienced. They weren't going to let us leave. We were caught in a silent, smiling net. Panic seized me. I started to shove, to push past people, shouting, "Let us through." They just looked at me with pity, as if I were a child having a tantrum. "Easy there, Alara," they'd say softly. "Don't disrupt the pattern." I could hear Mayor Thompson's voice booming from the gazebo, beginning the ceremony. "And now, let us welcome our Keystone." I was out of time. In a last, desperate act, I did the one thing I could think of to create a real disruption. There was a long table laden with food for the post-ceremony feast. With a guttural scream, I ran at it, putting all my weight into it, and flipped it over. The sound of shattering glass and splintering wood was like a bomb going off in the reverent silence. It echoed for a moment too long, and in that echo, the world changed. The humming stopped. The steady candle flames all flickered wildly in unison, as if a great wind had blown through, and every single person in the crowd turned their head toward me at the exact same instant. The smiles were gone. For one terrifying second, every face, my mother's, my father's, Mr. Jensen's, the mayor's, held the same cold, reptilian, inhuman fury. It was a glimpse of the single consciousness that wore the townspeople like masks. That was my chance. I grabbed Caleb's hand and ran. I didn't look back. I sprinted for the tree line, dragging him behind me. I could feel their eyes on my back, a physical weight. I expected to be tackled, to be dragged down, but no one followed. They had already returned to the ceremony, their focus back on the empty space where the Keystone should have been, as if my outburst was a brief, unpleasant dream they had already forgotten. We plunged into the dark woods, stumbling over roots, branches clawing at us. We found my car, a beat-up old sedan I'd bought with saved wages from the diner. It started, thank God. I didn't even turn on the headlights until we hit the old logging trail that led away from town. The only official road out of Harmony Creek was blocked on festival night by an old ceremonial wooden barricade. No one ever used it. It was symbolic. I slammed my foot on the accelerator. The car roared toward it. "Hold on," I screamed to Caleb. We hit the barricade with a sickening crunch of splintering wood and screeching metal. The car bucked, but plowed through. And as we crossed the town line, I felt it. It wasn't a sound. It was a feeling. A violent, physical, and psychic snap. It felt like a cord that had been stretched taut my entire life had just been severed. It was a feeling of sudden, terrifying release, of being unmoored, of becoming adrift in a vast, empty ocean. We were out. But I had the sickening feeling that we hadn't escaped the net. We had just ripped a hole in it, and that was so much worse. The woman in my passenger seat fell silent. The only sound for miles was the hypnotic thrum of my tires on the wet asphalt. She was looking out the window, but I knew she was seeing the splintered barricade in her memory. "So you made it," I said softly, trying to steer her back to the present. "You got him out." She let out a short, bitter laugh that sounded more like a sob. "That's what I thought," she whispered, turning back from the window. Her eyes were pools of black in the dim light. For about an hour, I felt this wild, hysterical relief. We were free. I was singing at the top of my lungs with the radio, and Caleb was next to me, asleep. But he was there. He was real. The fading would stop. The Weaver couldn't reach him out here. I was so stupid, so naive. That first hour was pure, unadulterated bliss. The air coming through the open windows smelled of pine and damp earth. Real smells, not the sterile, floral scent of Harmony Creek. The music on the radio felt electric, each note a declaration of freedom. I looked over at Caleb, his small form curled up on the passenger seat, his breathing shallow but steady. His presence was a solid, reassuring weight. I wept with joy, tears of relief streaming down my face. We had done it. We had broken the pattern and escaped. She leaned her head back against the seat, the picture of exhaustion. The first sign that something was wrong came when we stopped for gas. It was one of those lonely 24-hour stations that speckle these highways, a little island of buzzing fluorescent light in a sea of black. I was filling the tank, and I noticed the logo on the sign. It was a stylized spiral, the same intricate, delicate spiral as the anchor's mark, the founder's symbol. I told myself it was a coincidence. It had to be. But my heart was pounding. The buzzing of the station's lights seemed to harmonize with that low-frequency hum I always heard in Harmony Creek. I went inside to pay, and the man behind the counter looked up at me. He was old, with a kind, wrinkled face and eyes the same washed-out blue as the founder's in his portrait. He smiled, and it was the Harmony Creek smile. Wide, placid, and utterly empty. "Lovely night for a drive," he said, his voice a low drawl. "You kids running from something, or to something?" I just stared at him, my blood turning to ice. I grabbed Caleb's hand and pulled him back to the car, leaving the change on the counter. I drove away, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. It didn't stop. The further we got from Harmony Creek, the more we saw it. A waitress in a diner 100 miles away had the same vacant smile. A billboard for a local insurance company used the founder's motto, "Weaving security into your life's pattern." The spiral was everywhere, on the mud flaps of trucks, in the pattern of a child's dress, on a flyer for a missing cat. It was like the world outside was just a distorted reflection of the town I'd fled. We hadn't escaped it. We had just entered a larger version of the prison. And Caleb, he wasn't getting better. He was getting worse. He was growing weaker, more translucent. Away from the concentrated energy of the town, his pattern was unraveling even faster. He would sleep for hours, and when he was awake, he barely spoke. His skin had a pale, shimmering quality, and sometimes, when the light hit him just right, I could almost see through his hand. He was fading from the world, and I was the only one left to watch him go. This morning was the worst. I handed him one of his favorite comic books, the one about the superhero who could fly. He just stared at the cover, his brow furrowed in confusion. Then he looked at his own hand holding the book, a look of profound dislocation on his face. "Whose hand is this?" he whispered. His sense of self was gone. He didn't know his own body anymore. "We've been on the road for 3 days now. Last night, he stopped being able to hold solid food. It just passed through him. He's so weak he can barely lift his head. The Weaver is taking him. It's pulling the threads, and there's nothing I can do to stop it." She trailed off, her voice cracking. She looked at the small, worn backpack in her lap. She clutched it like it was the only real thing left in the world. The cult, the town, they didn't try to stop you, I realized aloud. Flipping that table, crashing the gate. They just let you go. "Yes," she said. And this is when she looked directly at me, her eyes filled with a horror so profound, it made me want to look away. It took me until this morning to understand why. I thought I had beaten them. I thought I had broken their system by taking the Keystone and the anchor, but I didn't break it. I perfected it. Don't you see? An anchor's grief is the thread the Weaver uses. An anchor trapped in Harmony Creek, surrounded by happy, smiling people who don't remember her loss. That's potent. But an anchor out here, in the world? Alone, on the run, watching her beloved brother literally dissolve before her eyes, haunted by the smiling faces and spiral patterns everywhere she looks. The grief, the terror, the paranoia. It's 1,000 times more powerful. It's pure, uncut, and it's not confined to the town limits anymore. I didn't save Caleb. I just changed the ritual. They let me go because my escape, my flight, my horror, it's generating enough power to not just maintain their perfect little pattern in their tiny little town. It's enough to start spreading it. A little stain of Harmony Creek growing outward along the highways. I'm not just an anchor. I'm a typhoid Mary of sorrow. I'm the start of an epidemic. She reached up a trembling hand and pushed her hair back from her face. Then she held her hand up in the faint green light of the dashboard. I saw it for the first time this morning, she whispered. It started with a tingling, like frost spreading under the skin. Glowing faintly on the back of her hand, so delicate I almost couldn't see it, was an intricate silvery spiral, the anchor's mark. It was beautiful, and it was a brand. We reached a crossroads with a blinking yellow light. A small town lay sleeping a mile to the east. Here, she said, her voice devoid of all emotion. This is fine. I pulled over. She got out, clutching her backpack. She didn't look at me. She just started walking toward the town, a small, lonely figure heading into a place that might already be waiting for her. I watched until she was swallowed by the darkness. I should have driven away. I should have turned west and put as many miles between me and her story as possible. But I couldn't. I sat at that crossroads for a long time, the engine idling. I looked down at the steering wheel, at my own hands. I thought about the strange, vacant smiles you sometimes see on the faces of strangers. I thought about the odd coincidences and patterns that thread through our lives. And with a dawning sense of dread, I realized I couldn't remember the name of the town she had told me about. It was on the tip of my tongue, but the harder I tried to grasp it, the more it slipped away, leaving only a faint, shimmering blur in my memory. All I could remember was her face and the terrible, beautiful mark on her hand.